You are standing in a cave in what is now Austria, 25,000 years ago, and someone has just carved a woman out of limestone. She has no face. She has no feet. Nobody bothered giving her toes or eyes or a mouth. But she has hips wide enough to look almost impossible, breasts heavy enough to rest on her stomach, and a belly that rolls forward in soft, deliberate folds. Whoever carved her spent hours on those folds. Hours. In an ice age. With stone tools. When every hour not spent hunting or gathering was an hour closer to starving. And here's the thing that should stop you cold. This wasn't an insult. This wasn't a joke figurine, a fertility gag passed around a fire. Archaeologists have found her sisters scattered across Europe, from France to Russia, carved over a span of thousands of years, by people who never met each other, who never shared a language, who never saw each other's work. And almost every single one of them has the same body. Wide hips. Heavy stomach. Soft, generous fat, carved with more care than the face, because the face wasn't the point. We call her the Venus of Willendorf now, and museums display her behind glass like a curiosity, a strange ancient joke about beauty standards. But she isn't a joke. She's a message sent across 25,000 years, and most of us have no idea how to read it. Because if you showed that same body to most people today and asked, "Is this beautiful?" a huge number would hesitate. Some would say no outright. We have spent the last 100 years building an entire culture, an entire industry, around the opposite idea, that thin is the standard, those the goal, that the smaller you make your body, the more attractive it becomes. So here's the question, the one this entire video is built around. If softness, roundness, and visible body fat were the standard of human attractiveness for the overwhelming majority of our history, across almost every continent, in almost every culture we have evidence for, then why do we assume the opposite is natural? Why do we act like slenderness is the default setting for human desire, when the actual record says something completely different? And the answer is not simply food was scarce, so fat looked nice. That's the lazy version, the one that gets repeated in a sentence and moved past. The real answer is stranger and more mathematical than that. It involves famine cycles that kill the predictable percentage of every population every few years, a hormone system that quietly tracks your body's fuel reserves before it allows you to reproduce, a visual signal so reliable that cultures who never made contact with each other landed on the exact same preference independently, and an economic flip, a total reversal. That happened so recently and so completely that it convinced you the new version was the old, natural, obvious one. Because here's the thing nobody tells you, your body's idea of attractive is not running on your century. It's running on a program written across 2 million years, and only recently, in a blink of evolutionary time, did we start feeding it data that program was never designed to receive. Let's start with the killing. For almost the entire span of human existence, the biggest threat to your life was not a predator, not a rival tribe, not disease, although all of those mattered. The biggest recurring threat was the calendar. Seasons ended. Herds migrated somewhere else. A drought hit, or a flood, or a winter that lasted 3 weeks longer than anyone expected, and suddenly the food that had been abundant a month earlier simply wasn't there anymore. Hunter-gatherer populations, and the farming populations that came after them, lived inside boom and bust cycles that repeated over and over across a single lifetime. Feast then famine. Feast then famine. Not as a metaphor. As a literal, physical rhythm that every human body had to survive or fail to survive. And here's the part that connects directly to attraction. A body carrying visible fat reserves was a body that had already proven, in front of everyone, that it could survive the next famine. It wasn't decoration. It was data. It was a walking, breathing certificate of resilience, visible from across a camp, readable at a glance, requiring no conversation and no explanation. You didn't need to ask someone if their family had good hunting grounds or reliable stores. You could just look at them. The body itself was the resume. Anthropologists studying traditional societies that still lived close to this rhythm within living memory, groups like the Juhoansi of the Kalahari, documented exactly this pattern. Body weight in these communities rose and fell with the seasons, predictably, almost like a tide. People gained fat during the months when food was plentiful and lost it during the lean months that followed, sometimes losing a noticeable percentage of their body weight every single year, only to rebuild it again when the rains or the migrations returned. A body that could store enough fat to survive the lean stretch and still look strong afterward wasn't showing off. It was demonstrating, in the most literal physical sense, a track record. And in a small community where everyone knew everyone, that track record was public information, visible on the body itself, long before anyone spoke a single word to each other. Now push that logic into reproduction, because this is where it stops being abstract and starts being biological. A woman's body does not treat pregnancy as a simple yes or no decision. It treats it as a resource calculation, constantly, quietly in the background, using a feedback loop most people have never heard of. Fat tissue produces a hormone called leptin, and leptin does something remarkable. It reports back to the brain on how much stored energy the body is currently sitting on. Too little fat, too little leptin, and a whole cascade of reproductive signals simply shuts down. Ovulation becomes irregular or stops. The body, in effect, refuses to gamble a pregnancy on reserves it isn't sure will last 9 months, let alone survive the brutal caloric demand of breastfeeding afterward, which can cost several hundred extra calories a day for a year or more. This is not a modern phenomenon. Endurance athletes and famine survivors today show the exact same pattern that anthropologists find in the archaeological and ethnographic record. Strip away enough body fat, and fertility quietly switches off, as a protective mechanism, not a punishment. Which means that for most of human history, a visibly fuller body was not just a symbol of resilience to the group. It was, for potential partners scanning a crowd without any of them consciously doing the math, a genuine, physiological signal of fertility. Of a body that had enough in reserve to actually carry a pregnancy to term and survive the aftermath. Desire, in other words, was quietly reading biology, and biology was quietly reading the food supply. This is not just a story anthropologists tell. In the 1990s, the psychologist Devendra Singh ran a series of studies asking people across different cultures to rate figures with varying body sizes and varying waist-to-hip ratios. The specific finding that made headlines was about proportion, a waist noticeably narrower than the hips, rather than overall thinness, and Singh argued this ratio tracked reliably with fertility and reproductive health regardless of how much total fat a body carried. Later researchers pushed back, tested more isolated populations, and found the picture was messier and far more dependent on local food scarcity than Singh's original claims suggested. But underneath the academic argument, one thing kept showing up again and again across dozens of separate research teams. In societies where food was scarce or unpredictable, heavier bodies were consistently rated as more attractive, and that preference reliably softened or reversed only in populations with steady, abundant access to food. The proportion mattered. But so, unmistakably, did the raw presence of fat itself, and it tracked the food supply with almost mechanical precision. But if this were only about biology, only about leptin and famine cycles, you'd expect it to fade the instant scarcity ended. It didn't. It got stranger. It became a story about status. Because here's the thing nobody stops to ask. Once societies stopped being small bands wandering after herds and started stacking up into hierarchies, kingdoms, empires, cities, fat stopped being only a biological signal and became something closer to a currency. Think about who, in almost any pre-industrial society you can name, actually had reliable access to surplus food. It wasn't the field laborer breaking their back from sunrise to sunset for a landlord. It wasn't the fisherman going out in a storm because an empty net meant an empty stomach. It was the people at the top. The nobility. The merchants. The clergy. The ones who didn't have to burn thousands of calories a day just to survive, and who had first pick of whatever surplus existed. Fatness, in that world, wasn't just fertility. It was leisure made visible. It said, I do not labor in the way you labor. I do not go hungry in the way you go hungry. I have arrived somewhere you have not. You can watch this idea play out explicitly across cultures that had almost no contact with each other. In parts of West Africa, most famously Mauritania, a practice historically called leblo involved deliberately feeding young women, sometimes force-feeding them, to help them gain significant weight before marriage, because a fuller body was considered proof of a family wealthy enough to afford it, and a bride healthy enough to survive childbirth and the years of nursing that followed. In numerous Pacific Island cultures, including parts of Polynesia and Micronesia, a larger, more robust body was historically associated with chiefly status, strength, and social importance, so much so that some communities had traditions of purposefully feeding chiefs and high-status individuals to increase their size before major ceremonies. In Renaissance Europe, painters like Peter Paul Rubens filled canvas after canvas with soft, round, heavy-bodied women, painted not as a private fetish but as the mainstream aesthetic ideal of their moment, admired publicly and displayed in the homes of the wealthy. The word Rubenesque exists today specifically because that body type was, for centuries, simply what beautiful meant. Travel to Tang Dynasty China, roughly the 7th through 10th centuries, and you find the same pattern wearing different clothes. The imperial court's most celebrated beauty, Yang Guifei, was famously full-figured by the standards later dynasties would prefer, and court paintings from that era consistently favor round faces, soft arms, and generous frames over the slender ideal that would come to dominate later Chinese aesthetics. Look at temple sculpture across large parts of India from roughly the same broad era, the voluptuous yakshur figures carved into stone with wide hips and heavy breasts, celebrated as symbols of fertility and abundance rather than hidden or minimized. None of these artists had seen a Rubens painting. None of them had heard of the Venus of Willendorf. They were separated by oceans, languages, and thousands of years, and yet the underlying preference kept resurfacing, independently invented, again and again, wherever food was hard-won and a full body was rare enough to be worth admiring. None of these cultures were copying each other. They arrived at strikingly similar conclusions independently, which is exactly the kind of pattern anthropologists look for when they're trying to separate a coincidence from something closer to a universal human tendency. And the tendency seems to be this: when calories are hard to get, and going hungry is a real and recurring threat, the human eye and the human body both learn to read visible fat as good news, as safety, as someone who has enough, and therefore has enough to share. Which brings us to the part of the story that actually explains why you, sitting here right now, might not feel any of this in your gut the way people did for most of history. Because something happened, fast, on an evolutionary timescale, that flipped the entire signal upside down. And it wasn't a change in human biology. Human bodies did not evolve a new preference in the last 150 years. What changed was the food supply itself, and once that changed, the meaning of a fuller body flipped along with it. Here's the part that's going to bend your brain a little. For the entire span of human history that we've been discussing, calorie-dense food was expensive, scarce, or both. Sugar, refined grain, fat, oil, all of it took enormous labor to produce or import, which meant it was mostly available to people with money. Then, over the course of roughly a century, starting with industrialized agriculture, refined sugar production, and eventually mass food processing, calorie-dense food became the cheapest thing on the shelf. A bag of chips costs less than a bag of vegetables in an enormous number of places today. Sugar, once a luxury good rich enough to be locked in cabinets, is now added to bread. The scarcity that used to separate the fed from the hungry essentially vanished for a huge portion of the developed world within a few generations. And once that scarcity disappeared, the old signal broke completely. Fatness no longer reliably meant this person has access to surplus and leisure. In a world flooded with cheap calories and demanding, sedentary work schedules that leave little time or money for the alternative, it started meaning something closer to the opposite. Meanwhile, the new scarce resource, the new rare and expensive thing, became the ability to eat carefully, exercise consistently, hire trainers, buy fresh produce instead of processed food, and have the leisure time to build a body through deliberate effort rather than survive on whatever was cheapest and fastest. Slenderness, muscle tone, visible discipline over the body, These became the new Fat Venus figurine. Not because human desire rewired itself, but because the thing that used to be rare, food, became common, and the thing that used to be common, leisure and control, became rare. The exact same underlying instinct, notice what is difficult to obtain, and read it as valuable, simply pointed itself at a completely different target. It's worth pausing on how strange this actually is, biologically speaking. Almost no other primate experiences hunger and reproduction as such tightly linked systems. Human pregnancy and especially human breastfeeding are extraordinarily expensive compared to almost any other species relative to body size, partly because human infants are born so helpless and grow such large, calorically hungry brains in the years that follow. A human body that gambles on pregnancy without adequate fat reserves isn't just risking a difficult 9 months. It's risking a multi-year commitment of extreme caloric demand, in a species that historically had no guaranteed backup plan if the harvest failed or the herd moved on. Seen that way, the leptin system isn't some strange evolutionary accident. It's a brutally practical checkpoint, one that ties visible desirability directly to the exact resource, stored energy, that determines whether a pregnancy can actually be completed and a child can actually be raised to an age where it can feed itself. This is the twist most people never get told. The natural modern beauty standard isn't more natural than the one that came before it. It's running the same ancient software, scarcity signals value, on completely different, historically brand new inputs. Your instincts didn't get more sophisticated. Your environment got flipped upside down, and your instincts, quietly, obediently, followed the data. So when you look at that faceless limestone woman in a museum case, carved by someone freezing through an ice age winter, understand what you're actually looking at. Not a strange ancient error in taste. Not evidence that ancient humans simply didn't know any better. You're looking at a species accurately, efficiently reading its own environment, the same way it's reading the environment right now, just with the scarcity dial pointed somewhere else. Which raises an uncomfortable question we haven't touched yet, because if the standard flipped once, completely, in under 2 centuries, driven entirely by what food happened to be cheap or expensive at the time, there's no reason to assume it's finished moving. And there's a specific, deliberate moment in the 20th century where an entire industry noticed this shift happening and decided to speed it up on purpose, for profit, in ways that are still shaping the mirror you looked in this morning. Because somewhere between the flapper era of the 1920s, the rationed, austere years of 2 world wars, and the explosion of glossy magazine advertising that followed, someone realized that a beauty standard doesn't have to be discovered. It can be manufactured, marketed, and sold back to an entire population as if it had always been the natural, obvious truth. The same instinct that once read a fuller body as safety was about to be redirected, deliberately, at diet pills, exercise equipment, and an ever-shifting, ever-narrowing target that no food-scarce ancestor of yours would have recognized at all. That's a different story, for a different day. But the next time you catch yourself measuring your own body against a standard that feels timeless, remember the woman carved in limestone, faceless, footless, and utterly convinced, by everyone who ever looked at her, that she was exactly right.